First of all, this webinar is being recorded. We're going to post it up on our YouTube channel. You can find it at youtube.com/TrustedSecTV. Replays will be available later today. And I just wanted to let you know, if you have questions for Chris as he's going through the webinar, just put it in the Q&A function. He'll take a look at those questions at the end of the webinar and answer anything that's in there. So he's going to get started here, so I'll just hand it over to Chris.
All right, thank you much. So I'm Chris Camejo. I've been working with federal agencies and contractors on information security compliance for over a decade, and I'm a CMMC RP. So today we're going to be talking about information security compliance obligations for Department of Defense contractors as it relates to two types of information known as FCI and CUI. So a high-level overview, we're going to start with a high-level overview of the DoD Contractor Security Program, how to recognize CUI, the key contract clauses that impose security responsibility on contractors, the safeguards that contractors providing cloud services will need to implement, the safeguards that non-cloud contractors will need to implement, the details of the new CMMC certification program, and then a little bit, if we have some time, a deeper dive into two of the key documents required by all of those programs. So taking our start here, getting into the DoD Contractor Information Security Program and how it works and what it's trying to protect. The key thing to understand at this point is there are two main contract clauses that require contractors to protect information. The first is a government-wide clause called FAR 52204-21 that requires contractors to protect federal contract information, or FCI, using 15 basic safeguards. The other is a DoD-specific clause that we're going to call DFARS 7012. You can see the full number up there on the screen. And that requires contractors to protect controlled unclassified information called CUI. The security requirements for CUI differ depending on whether the contractor or subcontractors are a cloud service provider. Cloud providers have to use the security controls from a document called NIST SP 800-53. And all other contractors have to use the security controls from NIST SP 800-171. And some CUI will also require some new controls from NIST 800-172. That one just came out. So CMMC and FedRAMP are two other things you may hear about, and these can be thought of as certification programs to verify that contractors have implemented their contractual obligations to protect CUI and FCI. FedRAMP is for cloud contractors, so that's focused with that NIST 853. And CMMC is for all other contractors, so that's focused on those 15 basic safeguards for the FCI, plus NIST 800-171 and potentially 172 for CUI. And as we go through this whole thing, just always keep in mind, contract clauses are the sole source of a contractor's compliance obligations with regards to FCI and CUI. You may come across other federal regulations related to CUI, but those regulations define the government's obligations and do not apply directly to contractors. And it's also worth pointing out that CMMC is a new certification program, but it applies to things that contractors were supposed to be doing for years. So every DoD contractor that will have a CMMC compliance obligation when it rolls out should already have the 15 basic safeguards and the NIST 800-171 controls in place for any FCI and CUI that they're already handling. Most contractors realize they're unlikely to win DoD contracts if they don't agree to properly protect FCI and CUI, but there are other consequences if contractors, say, claim to implement these required controls without actually doing so. The False Claims Act allows the government to assess a financial penalty and triple damages when a contractor makes false claims. For example, accepting a contract clause that says they're going to implement NIST 800-171 and not actually implementing it. This law is enforced. The government received $2.68 billion in settlements and judgments just in fiscal year 2023 for false claims, and that includes a $4 million settlement against a single contractor for failing to implement the required security controls. So I've heard contractors complain about how much of a hassle it is to comply with all these security requirements, but this is the cost of doing business with the DoD, and they can make it even more costly if you don't want to follow their rules. So these requirements are all about protecting FCI and CUI, so I want to take a minute to make sure we understand what those are. I've broken out the official definitions of FCI and CUI into some simplified bullet points, and I've included the references up there at the top to the source material on this slide, and you'll see those on other slides as well, so you can always find the source information that I'm pulling this from. Contractors can think of CUI as a subset of FCI, which is why I've kind of nested the boxes here on the screen. And the definitions are similar. Both of them explicitly cover information, so objects are not FCI or CUI, even if they're created based on FCI or CUI. But keep in mind, media like hard drives or USB drives or paper that contains FCI or CUI must be protected because of the contents, even though the object is not FCI or CUI. Both of these definitions address the relationship of the information to the government, and they use different words, but the meanings are essentially the same. Only information that a contractor creates for or handles for the government can be FCI or CUI. And after this is where the definitions diverge. FCI is information not intended for public release. CUI is information that government agencies must safeguard or control in accordance with certain laws, regulations, or government-wide policies. So obviously, non-public information is a much broader category than information that has specific legal, regulatory, or policy requirements, again, that only apply to the government. So nearly all information handled under a DoD contract will be FCI, while only certain narrowly defined information within those laws, regulations, and policies will be CUI. Both of these definitions go on to give us some exclusions. FCI excludes public information, which confirms what we already know from the definition, and transactional information, so things like payment routing details. The CUI definition excludes information that contractors handle that did not come from or was not created or possessed by or for the government. Again, confirming what the definition already told us. Your own internal proprietary information is not CUI, and also excludes classified information. So a contractor never needs to treat its own proprietary internal information as FCI or CUI because the definitions tell us repeatedly that information must be possessed for or on behalf of the government. The DoD may have to treat proprietary information as CUI if they receive it from the contractor, but that does not affect how the contractor handles their own information. So nothing in the CUI program eliminates a contractor's responsibility with regards to other laws and regulations that directly apply to them. For example, things like the Arms Control Export Act, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, and the Export Administration Regulations. These directly applicable laws and regulations also do not automatically make the information they cover CUI. So that definition for CUI tells us that the law, regulation, or government-wide policy must apply to the government's handling of the information, not the contractor's handling of it to be CUI. So contractors will need to apply both CUI safeguards and any directly applicable requirements when laws, regulations, and policies apply both to the government's handling of information and directly to the contractor's handling of that same information. So from there, the scope of the CUI security requirements are all based on where CUI is handled. So let's get into how to identify CUI, which seems to be a recurring concern from my conversations with clients. In the past, you may have handled information with legacy markings like FOUO or SBU or LES. All these legacy designations were created independently by different government agencies, and each agency had its own markings and protection rules. The CUI program was to simplify the protection of sensitive information by replacing all the different agency-specific programs with a single, consistent government-wide CUI program. As per government regulations, the agencies that have implemented the CUI program, like the DoD, should no longer send any information with legacy markings to contractors. But legacy information does not automatically become CUI. Agencies that have implemented the CUI program, including DoD, are required to go through their legacy information to determine if it meets the definition of CUI and remark it appropriately as CUI before sending it to contractors. And the CUI program also doesn't magically alter any existing contracts. So contractors must continue to protect any legacy information using the terms from the contract that that information was received under, regardless of any new requirements for CUI that are coming out. So your old FOUO documents, keep treating them the way you have been. Don't treat them as CUI. There seems to be this persistent myth that it's difficult for contractors to understand what CUI they're handling. And I want to crush that myth because it comes up so often. This is a section from the DOD's CUI instructions for its own personnel, along with an entry from the DOD CUI FAQ. And the highlighted sections here, they both make it clear that CUI must be identified in the contract and that documents that contain CUI must be marked by DOD. So something has gone very wrong if the DOD or another contractor is sending you surprise or unmarked CUI. If a contractor suspects they're receiving surprise or unmarked CUI, that's a big deal. Also, if non-CUI is being marked as CUI, maybe somebody's going crazy and just marking everything, that should be immediately reported to the contracting officer as per the clause here in the DOD FAQ. And another myth that I want to dispel is that the definition of CUI is so broad that nearly any information handled by a contractor can be CUI. The DoD maintains a list of categories and dissemination controls that are used in document markings, and those are shown here, these two lists. National Archives also maintains a master copy of these lists. Information must fit into those definitions in the laws and regulations and government-wide policies referenced in those categories on the left to be CUI, and it will be marked with the applicable category. The limited dissemination controls define how the government can share CUI, and documents that contain CUI with one of these dissemination controls will be marked with both the CUI category from the left list and the limited dissemination control from the list on the right here. Contractors don't need to worry about these underlying laws, regulations, and policies because your contract remains the sole source of your compliance obligations with regards to the CUI you handle. As shown in this flowchart from a DoD CUI marking briefing, DoD will determine whether the information is CUI, what category it falls into, what limited dissemination controls apply, and DoD will then apply standard markings before the CUI ever gets to you. And these examples are taken from the DoD CUI marking aid, and they show how DoD documents containing CUI will be marked before they're released to contractors. Every DoD document that contains CUI will have CUI headers and footers and a designation indicator block that defines the CUI categories, the limited dissemination controls, and a point of contact. Even emails, the example on the top left here, even emails will have CUI markings if they contain CUI. Some documents may have banners on the cover page that are known as distribution statements. These markings are independent of the CUI program and do not automatically mean that a document contains CUI. A document that contains CUI will have CUI markings regardless of whether it has a DoD distribution statement, and not every document that contains CUI will have a distribution statement. Many contractors are also confused and concerned about marking information that they generate as CUI. So first, let's state the obvious. If CUI is copied out of another existing document, it remains CUI, and the new document that the information is pasted into must be marked as CUI as well. Beyond that, contractors only need to mark CUI when they're instructed to do so in the contract documentation. DoD's contracting instructions shown here state that contracts and supporting documents should indicate when a contractor is creating CUI and what needs to be marked by the contractor. DoD may include CUI marking requirements in the Form 1423, known as a Contract Data Requirements List or CDRL, and alternatively, that information may be found in the contract itself. So as always, review your contract documents carefully. If the contract documents do not instruct you to mark specific information you create as CUI, you likely don't have any obligation to mark the information you create. And Remember, as per that definition of CUI, information created by the contractor cannot be CUI if it is not created for the government. So now that we have an idea of what FCI and CUI are and how to identify them, let's look at that DoD contract clause as it relates to the protection of FCI and CUI. So the DoD has a set of regulations that define standard contract clauses and instruct DoD contracting personnel on when to include those clauses in contracts. And these are part of what's called the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement, or DFARS. I'm showing a summary of the DFARS contract clauses related to CUI. So the first two at the top here, 7008 and 7019, only show up in solicitations, RFPs, and are basically warning the contractor that they will need to implement all the other clauses here that show up in those contracts. Clause 7012 is the main clause that requires protection of CUI, and it requires the security controls for contractors, approval from DoD for any variances from those requirements, applying any other necessary security controls, and reporting cyber incidents to DoD and upstream contractors. The 7009 clause builds on that. It requires those upstream contractors to protect any cyber incident reports they receive from their subcontractors. The 7021 clause requires CMMC certification and reporting of compliance lapses to the DoD. And the 7020 clause requires the contractor to allow DoD access to relevant systems for the purpose of performing assessments when necessary. The full contents of these clauses must be pasted into DoD contracts word for word from the DFARS. And these are available online, so you can look up the full text of these. This is just my summary. Contractors should also be pasting these complete clauses into their subcontracts when they're applicable. So any clauses about like CUI or CMMC, FedRAMP, NIST 800-171, or NIST 800-53 that don't align with these official government contract clauses should be treated as suspect. I've been seeing vague, you must be CMMC compliant clauses in subcontracts for years, and they're all nonsense, both because they don't align with the official text from DFARS 7021 and because DoD has not begun issuing contracts with CMMC clauses yet. So if you ever have any questions about the clauses in your contracts, reach out to the upstream contractor or the government contracting officer for clarification. These are the DoD's instructions to its own personnel, telling them when to insert that 7012 clause for protecting CUI into contracts. You can see how the 7012 clause is required to be inserted in all contracts unless they're solely for commercial off-the-shelf items. Nothing in this instruction says anything about determining whether CUI will be handled under the contract before inserting this clause. So contractors can expect to receive the 7012 clause even if they'll not be handling CUI. And this has led to a bunch of confusion as contractors see this clause in their contracts and scramble to protect the enormous volumes of imaginary unmarked CUI that they suddenly think that they're receiving and creating. And we'll get into that in a bit. The 7012 clause's security requirements, shown here, are also a confusing mess. Notice how the first and second bullet points refer to systems that are or are not part of a service or system operated on behalf of the government. Operated on behalf of the government is government speak for cloud service. You may also hear cloud services referred to as federal information systems because the government effectively treats a cloud service as if it's their own system that just happens to be run by somebody else. Non-cloud systems may be referred to as non-federal information systems because they're operated by the contractor for their own purposes. This means there are two separate sets of requirements. One set for contractors providing cloud service and another set for all other contractors. We can see that the bullets under bullet 1 make clear that this set of requirements only applies to cloud services and that non-cloud services are subject to other requirements. The second bullet contains those other requirements for systems that are not cloud services. The cloud security requirement refers us to another contract clause, while the non-cloud security requirement refers us to NIST 800-171, and we'll cover both of those requirements in more detail. But first, notice how this clause repeatedly mentions that the requirements apply to, quote, covered contractor information systems. This term is the key to understanding what systems, if any, are in scope for these security requirements. The next step is to understand what qualifies as a covered contractor information system. But don't forget the clause at the end that says contractors have to implement any additional security measures to address unique circumstances or temporary deficiencies. This is a nasty trap for contractors that know they have security problems and ignore them. Even if the NIST 800-171 controls or the cloud controls don't apply to something, you should still fix that under this clause. So figuring out the meaning of that covered contractor information system term leads us down a rabbit hole of definitions contained in the 7012 clause. In this case, we can see that to be considered a covered contractor information system, the system must be owned or operated by or for a contractor and must process, store, or transmit covered defense information. This means we need to know what covered defense information is. Another definition from the 7012 clause tells us that covered defense information includes controlled technical information or other information in the CUI registry. That was the category list that I just showed. So controlled technical information itself is a CUI category listed in the CUI registry. So really, covered defense information is just CUI by another name. So this means if a contractor is not processing or storing or transmitting CUI, then there's no covered defense information, and that means there's no covered contractor information systems for the 7010 clause or NIST 800-171 to apply to. Effectively, contractors without CUI don't need to do anything to meet the 7012 clause's security requirements. And we've mostly been talking about CUI, but while we're reviewing contract clauses, it's worth taking a brief look at that government-wide FCI clause that will also show up in DOD contracts. And the FAR 52-204-21 contract clause tells us that contractors must apply basic safeguarding requirements to, here's that term again, covered contractor information systems. But covered contractor information system is defined differently in this clause than it was in the CUI clause we just looked at. In this case, it's a system owned or operated by the contractor that is processing, storing, or transmitting FCI. This clause directly contains the 15 basic safeguards that apply to the covered systems. That's the big wall of text you see here. And these 15 safeguards are a subset of the NIST 800-171 requirements. So a system that meets NIST 800-171 for protecting CUI is also suitable for handling FCI. A contractor may want to handle FCI in systems that don't handle CUI, though. And if those systems don't meet NIST 800-171, then these 15 safeguards have to be implemented on those FCI handling systems as well. So now that we know contractors only need to worry about CUI protection requirements if they're actually handling CUI, let's look at the cloud requirements, and then we'll get into the non-cloud requirements next. So there's a separate section of DFARS that covers cloud services. The cloud clauses aren't directly related to CUI, but the DFARS 7012 CUI clause refers cloud service providers to this 7010 clause for security requirements, so here we are. The 7010 clause instructs contractors to get approval to use cloud services if they previously said they would not, implement some DoD cloud security requirements that come from another document, keep government data within the US unless given permission otherwise, and only use government data for approved purposes, and report cyber incidents. So the part of this that's most relevant to CUI protection is that external document, that Cloud Computing Security Resources Guide that's referenced here. So let's look at that. This Cloud Computing SRG defines various impact levels with different requirements, where higher numbered impact levels have more controls. The document says CUI warrants a minimum impact level of 4, although higher levels may be required by contracts if other more sensitive or classified information is being handled. Impact level 4 requires the contractor implement the controls from the FedRAMP moderate baseline, supplement those with some additional DoD controls from a separate document called CNSSI 1253, and potentially adds some more controls from that CNSSI 1253 depending on the other data that's being handled. So now we need to know what this FedRAMP moderate thing is. FedRAMP is a program to certify cloud services against the NIST 853 requirements so they can be used by government agencies. And NIST 853 is what federal agencies use to protect their own information systems. So NIST 853 and FedRAMP both have 3 security baselines with different sets of controls, and those are low, moderate, and high baselines. As we saw in the cloud computing SRG, the government has decided that the moderate baseline is appropriate for CUI, so that's our starting point. Cloud providers must have a FedRAMP certification, which is called an authorization, before they can work directly with government agencies. And this authorization process, which is what I'm showing on screen here, is long and complex. This is straight off the FedRAMP website. A government agency has to sponsor a cloud provider before they can start this FedRAMP authorization process. So you can't just go do this on your own and get certified. The DFARS 7012 clause for protecting CUI requires non-cloud contractors to make sure that cloud services they use to handle CUI are FedRAMP equivalent, not FedRAMP authorized. Cloud providers handling CUI for a contractor won't have a direct relationship with a government agency that they need to get that sponsorship necessary for a real FedRAMP authorization. So that's why the requirement says FedRAMP equivalent rather than FedRAMP authorized. An equivalent means that that cloud provider will need to demonstrate to the contractor that they align with the appropriate FedRAMP baseline, even though they may not have an actual FedRAMP authorization. So cloud providers working direct with the government, FedRAMP authorization. Cloud providers working only for contractors, FedRAMP equivalent. So now we need to look at that CNSSI 1253 document because the DoD Cloud Computing SRG told us we need to add some more controls from that document to the FedRAMP moderate baseline. Specifically, it tells us to refer to Table D1, which is shown here on the right. That little piece that says CIA MMX is the key to knowing what we need to use from this table. CIA refers to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability columns. MMX is telling us that we need to use the M controls in the C for confidentiality and I for integrity columns, but we can ignore the A for availability column. Keep in mind, this is the absolute bare minimum for cloud service providers. DoD may require using higher impact overlays, higher impact level, high rather than moderate, or overlays, depending on what other information is handled. Overlays are additional documents like the one I show here for privacy that add even more controls to a particular baseline. These cover various topics like privacy, space systems, and intelligence. There's a whole bunch of them. Some of the overlays are considered sensitive themselves and may be marked FOUO or CUI, so they're only available from the government as needed by contractors. Cloud providers must read the additional details in their contracts and supporting documents and review the Cloud Computing SRG for additional requirements applicable to each unique situation. This is an example FedRAMP control. Each control has a number and a name, and the FedRAMP documents indicate which baselines include the control. In this case, control CM3 is in the moderate and high baselines. Each control lists specific requirements that must be implemented. Some controls will contain assignments shown in brackets. You can see a few in here. These come from the original NIST 853, where government agencies are free to define certain parameters of their program. In FedRAMP, some of these assignments may be left up to you, as in this example, or they may be predefined by FedRAMP. FedRAMP controls may also have a section with additional requirements and guidance above and beyond the requirements and guidance in NIST 853. The NIST 853 documents are a useful resource for contractors that want more background and detail than what's provided in the FedRAMP documents. The control numbers, names, and requirements are the same in both standards, so no mapping is necessary. You can just look up the control number directly in NIST 853. The difference between controls and control enhancements can be confusing. Even though they're called enhancements, you should think of these as full-fledged controls. The difference is that a control enhancement builds on the requirements in the main control. And control enhancements can be included in or excluded from the FedRAMP baselines, just like any other control. And they're referred to using the main control number followed by the enhancement number in parentheses. Most controls will have a discussion section that explains the requirements in more detail. And this may be the most useful part of NIST 853 for contractors attempting to understand what the FedRAMP requirements are trying to get them to do. Another useful document is NIST 853A. This contains the assessment instructions. So it's basically the cheat sheet for what evidence an auditor will want to see when they're testing compliance. The 7012 clause says non-cloud contractors must apply the security controls from NIST 800-171. So let's take a look at what that means. NIST 800-171 is another set of security controls derived from the same NIST 853 moderate security baseline that's used by FedRAMP. In this case, NIST 800-171 only includes the controls that are relevant to the protection of CUI on contractor systems. The NIST 800-171 requirements that apply to non-cloud contractors are currently going through some changes, though. Revision 2 of the standard, shown here on the left, was officially withdrawn in May of 2024 in favor of the new Revision 3, shown on the right. But DoD contracts, including CMMC, still refer to Revision 2. So you'll need to read your contracts closely because someday you may end up in a situation where you must protect CUI received under some old contracts using Revision 2 and other new contracts using Revision 3. And just like NIST 853, there's a main NIST 800-171 standard document that contains the requirements and guidance, and a separate NIST 800-171A document that contains the instructions for assessing compliance. Again, your cheat sheet for what evidence the auditor is going to want to see. The 7012 clause and NIST 800-171 have existed for years, and DoD contractors handling CUI are all required to self-assess and report their scores for compliance. DoD is assigned a score to each control and publishes the self-assessment scoring template shown here on the left, and contractors report their scores using the Supplier Performance Risk System website known as SPRS. CMMC continues to build on this concept. The controls scores and SPRS reporting will remain in place under CMMC. At level 3, the DoD's assessor, and we'll get into CMMC levels in a bit, but at CMMC level 3, the DoD's assessor will handle entry into their own system called EMAS that then syncs the scores over to SPRS. There's also some hidden extra requirements in NIST 800-171 Revision 2 that organizations need to be aware of. These are called the NFO controls, and many of them are about documenting, disseminating, and updating policies and procedures to support the other technical controls in 800-171. And there are also some more technical controls buried in here as well. You can find these NFO controls in the Appendix E of NIST 800-171, where there's a list of all the NIST 853 controls that were used to create NIST 800-171 and why they were included or excluded. One of the tags for excluded controls is NFO, which you can see on Control AC1 in this part of the list, shown on the left here. NFO stands for non-federal organization, i.e. contractors. And we can see from the definition that these controls are, quote, expected to be routinely satisfied by non-federal organizations without specification. Translating that into normal people speak, the government expects contractors to implement these controls without the government explicitly telling them that they have to do this by putting it in the list of NIST 800-171 controls. For many contractors, especially small ones, it's a stretch to think that they're out there documenting policies and procedures if it's not explicitly required. So it's kind of wild for the government to think that they don't need to include this stuff in the core of NIST 800-171 if they want it done. But here we are. So the government has seen the error of their assumptions, and these extra controls have now been added back into the main control list for NIST 800-171 Revision 3. In the meantime, contractors using Revision 2 should be implementing the NFO controls in addition to the main NIST 800-171 controls. So now that we have an understanding of the DoD CUI protection program, let's take a dive into what we can expect from the upcoming CMMC certification program. CMMC defines 3 certification levels. Level 1 is essentially the same as the existing FAR 52-204-21 FCI protection requirement. The main difference is the requirement for a self-assessment, where the current FCI protection clause requires compliance, but does not require any type of assessment. If you're not handling CUI, you should only be getting CMMC Level 1 requirements in your contracts. Level 2 is almost the same as the existing 7012 clause. It still applies to CUI and relies on the same NIST 800-171 controls that non-cloud contractors should already be using to protect CUI under the 7012 clause. One big difference is the scope, which is broader as it applies to more than just the systems that directly process, store, or transmit CUI. More details on that in a bit. Another difference is that some contractors may be required to have a third-party audit performed by a certified third-party assessor, or a C3PAO. The government loves their acronyms, while other contractors will be able to self-assess, and we expect most contractors will be able to self-assess. The current DoD CUI program only requires self-assessments, no third-party audits. Each contract will state what level that contract requires and whether a self-assessment or third-party audit by a certified company is required for certification. So contract by contract basis, you have to read them. Level 3 is completely new, and it's for CUI that the DoD deems to be extra sensitive. And again, that'll be indicated in the contract. The scope is similar, but not identical to the scope requirements for level 2. We'll get into those. And there's a new set of security controls defined in NIST 800-172 that will apply to this information. NIST 800-172 is not a standalone set of requirements. It's an add-on for NIST 800-171 that contains some extra controls that build on the 800-171 controls. All contractors at level 3 will require a third-party audit by the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, or DIBCAC, which is part of the DoD. So you're going to have DoD auditors crawling around your systems if you're dealing with level 3 CUI. I don't expect contractors to spend much time determining the appropriate CMMC requirements to pass on to their subcontractors. So subs may receive higher level CMMC requirements than are necessary for the information they'll be handling. When this happens, I'd recommend checking with the contractor to determine if they'll actually be sending you CUI and what level CUI they'll be sending you, and then request that they adjust the CMMC level in the subcontract accordingly. So if they're only sending you FCI, they should not be asking you to be level 2 or 3, or if they're only sending you level 2 CUI, they shouldn't be asking you to be level 3. CMMC has a phased rollout, and there's a lot of confusion around this, so let's see what we can clear up. The CMMC program is defined in a new regulation, 32 CFR 170, and this regulation defines the scope, certification requirements, assessment processes, and this phased rollout timeline for CMMC. That regulation was just finalized in December 2024, so there shouldn't be any more changes to this part of the program prior to the rollout. The missing piece of the CMMC program is that updated DFARS 7021 contract clause that requires CMMC certifications and the contracting instructions that tell DoD personnel to put the CMMC clause in contracts. So effectively, CMMC exists, but is just not being put in contracts yet. The version of that 7021 clause we looked at a few minutes ago, that's a draft that was published for public comment. The clauses requiring CMMC certification won't be in contracts until that clause gets finalized and published as a new regulation. The comment period on the drafts for those closed in October of 2024, and we expect them to be finalized and published in early 2025. When the contract clause and instructions are finalized, they're going to contain an effective date. And that effective date in those published regulations is what will trigger phase 1 of the CMMC rollout. Each successive phase starts 1 calendar year after the start of the previous phase. And phase 4 is full implementation, where CMMC clauses will be in all applicable contracts. So the key takeaways from this giant chart are that level 1 and level 2 self-assessments will start immediately on that effective date. Most level 2 audits won't start until phase 2 a year later, and most level 3 audits won't start until phase 3, 2 years after the rollout date. DoD has discretion to require some assessments early or delay them to an option period during certain phases of this. So as always, read your contracts closely because you may have different requirements in each one. And it's also worth pointing out that getting a contract with a CMMC clause does not change your existing contracts. Continue protecting old CUI and legacy marked documents using the terms of the contract under which they were received, regardless of where we are in the CMMC rollout and what CMMC contracts you're receiving. The CMMC scope for FCI is simple. If a system processes, stores, or transmits FCI, it's in scope and must have the 15 basic safeguards applied and assessed. Specialized assets and anything that does not process, store, or transmit FCI are out of scope. And specialized assets are formally defined within the CMMC regulations, but generally include things like IoT devices and computerized industrial equipment, the stuff that isn't like what we normally think of as a computer. The CMMC divides the scope for levels 2 and 3 into 5 different categories of assets. The key takeaway here is that the scope extends to more than just the assets that process, store, or transmit CUI. The CUI assets category does cover the systems that directly process, store, or transmit CUI. And this is the same as that covered contractor information systems definition that we saw in the DFARS 7012 clause. The security protection assets category covers anything that provides security to something that's in scope for CMMC. So for example, your firewalls, your IPS, domain controllers, logging systems that are securing the CUI assets. The contractor risk managed assets category covers assets that can, but are not intended to process, store, or transmit CUI, and I'll get into more detail on what that means in a moment. This category, contractor risk managed assets, only exists in level 2. Assets that would be contractor risk managed assets in level 2 become CUI assets in level 3. Specialized assets is the same category we saw in level 1, all the industrial IoT type stuff. And finally, out of scope assets is basically defined as any asset that doesn't fall into any of these other categories. But I'll have some more detail on that in a moment as well. Carrying on with these 5 scope categories to look at the requirements, all in-scope assets, regardless of level, must be documented in the asset inventory, the system security plan, and the network diagram. For the most part, all assets in scope for level 2 and 3 must have the NIST 800-171 controls implemented, while assets in scope for level 3 must also have the NIST 800-172 controls implemented. The only exceptions are for those specialized assets, which can use a risk-based approach in level 2 and can have the requirements met by an intermediary device in level 3. So something to protect those specialized assets from the rest of the network. For out-of-scope assets, you need to be able to justify why they are unable to process, store, or transmit CUI for them to be out of scope. The assessment side gets wild. There's a whole bunch of different requirements for each category and level, but I'm not going to dive into that because a lighter assessment load doesn't change the requirements that you must implement on these systems shown on the previous slide. Intentionally skipping requirements because you don't expect them to be assessed would be a great way to find yourself on the wrong side of that False Claims Act. The definition of FCI and CUI assets is based on processing, storing, or transmitting FCI or CUI, and these are the CMMC definitions of process, store, and transmit. Most organizations have a good handle on which systems store FCI or CUI, but often overlook the systems that process or transmit FCI or CUI. For example, workstations that don't store FCI or CUI, but are used to enter FCI or CUI into a server-based application are processing FCI or CUI as per this definition and are in scope, as are workstations that are viewing FCI or CUI contained in a server-based application. Network switches, routers, and firewalls between the workstations and server are transmitting FCI or CUI back and forth between these assets and, as per this definition, are in scope as well. An attacker that manages to breach a workstation, switch, router, or firewall that processes or transmits FCI or CUI would be able to intercept that information, so these assets must be protected. In order for an asset to be out of scope for CMMC level 2 or 3, it must be separated from assets that process, store, or transmit CUI. The reason for this separation requirement is that attackers often gain footholds inside a network via less protected systems like workstations. From this initial foothold, an attacker can explore the network from inside the perimeter defenses and compromise other more sensitive systems via vulnerabilities that are only visible on the internal network. Any asset that can connect to CUI is therefore a threat to CUI and must be protected in accordance with CMMC requirements. Assets that a contractor wants to keep out of scope must be isolated from CUI for this threat to be mitigated. There are 2 types of separation, physical and logical. Physical separation means there's no wired or wireless connection, so the asset is air-gapped from CUI assets. This could mean the asset is in a different facility, is on a completely separate network within the same facility, or is not on a network at all. As soon as two assets are connected to the same network, including via a VPN, they're no longer physically separated, no matter how many firewalls you put between them. Network controls like firewalls are instead used to implement logical separation. Putting a firewall that blocks all ports and protocols between the assets you want to keep out of scope and CUI assets is an effective way to implement logical separation. Allowing a single port through that firewall would mean the assets are no longer separated and out of scope, though. As an example of this, let's say we have a file server. And on this file server is a folder that contains level 3 CUI. Obviously, this means that the server must be a level 3 CUI asset because it is storing level 3 CUI. If we have a workstation that accesses the level 3 CUI, then that workstation is also a level 3 CUI asset. Both the server and the workstation require level 3 CMMC controls. Where it gets tricky is if we have other folders that exclusively contain level 2 CUI, FCI, and information that's out of scope because it's neither CUI nor FCI. And a few more workstations. One that only ever accesses the level 2 CUI folder, one that only hits the FCI folder, and one that only accesses the out of scope folder. Ideally, we would like the workstations to only require the controls appropriate for the information type that they access, but unfortunately, that's not the case. The workstations are not separated from the server that stores level 3 CUI, so they can't be out of scope for level 3. You can put policies or procedures or practices like access permissions in place because these workstations are not intended to access that level 3 CUI, but they still can if they're compromised by an attacker, so that makes them level 3 CUI assets. We have a similar problem with level 2 CUI if we remove the level 3 CUI folder from the file server. The server is a level 2 CUI asset because it stores level 2 CUI. The workstations would be considered contractor risk managed assets and require level 2 controls because they can but are not intended to process, store, or transmit level 2 CUI via the server. Limiting the handling of CUI to certain systems with well-defined boundaries using physical or logical separation allows a contractor to apply the relevant security controls to just those systems rather than everything in their environment. Trying to apply CUI controls to the entire environment is usually an exercise in frustration and should be avoided in most cases. This is an example of how logical separation can be used to limit the scope of CMMC. In this case, we've created an isolated network segment where level 3 CUI is handled, and another isolated segment where level 2 CUI is handled. There are some systems that handle FCI mixed in with out-of-scope systems, a shared services network that provides authentication and logging services to everything in this environment, and a shared firewall that protects it all and isolates the network segments from each other. A few things to note here. The single firewall that protects the entire environment is considered a level 3 security protection asset because it's protecting the level 3 CUI domain from the internet and the other parts of this network. It's reasonable to expect CUI to move back and forth between the servers and workstations in each domain, so the switches would be considered CUI assets because they're transmitting CUI. This diagram shows separate physical switches for simplicity, but most organizations would use VLANs. If VLANs are used to isolate networks from each other, then any physical switch that carries a CUI domain VLAN should also be considered a security protection asset. There's a level 2 specialized asset mixed in with the level 2 CUI assets. Even though you can risk manage level 2 specialized assets, it's best to keep them in a CUI domain so that other assets don't get dragged into scope. The level 1 FCI assets being mixed in on a network segment with out-of-scope assets does not drag the out-of-scope assets into scope because the level 1 scope only extends to assets that directly process, store, or transmit FCI. The authentication and logging servers on the shared services network are level 3 security protection assets because they provide security services to level 3 CUI assets. These servers can provide services to everything in the environment because they should never process, store, or transmit CUI at any level and therefore don't meet the criteria for a CUI asset. You have to be very careful to avoid expanding scope when allowing connections through the firewall. If the firewall allows an otherwise out-of-scope workstation to access a level 2 CUI asset, it becomes a level 2 contractor risk managed asset and must have a CMMC level 2 controls applied. Even worse, if the workstation can access a level 3 CUI asset, then it becomes a level 3 CUI asset itself, and everything that can connect to that workstation also becomes a level 3 CUI asset because risk managed assets do not exist in level 3. This same principle applies if CUI ends up on or passing through systems that are supposed to be out of scope. The scope isn't contained by lines on a network diagram, it follows the flow of CUI. External service providers, or ESPs, are also potentially in scope for CMMC. In order to be in scope, the ESP must meet the criteria for a CUI asset or security protection asset, and also CUI or security protection data, things like logs or authentication information, must reside on the ESP assets. The specific requirements that apply depend on whether the ESP is a cloud provider or not, and whether the ESP is handling CUI or not. The basic principle is that every applicable control must be implemented and assessed regardless of whether it's outsourced. Breaking this down by category, cloud providers that handle CUI on behalf of the contractor must meet the FedRAMP requirements from the DFARS 7012 clause. Cloud providers that don't handle CUI do not need to meet FedRAMP, but must meet whatever requirements would apply to those services if they were on-premise rather than cloud-based. Non-cloud ESPs that handle CUI on behalf of the contractor require their own CMMC certification. Additionally, any of the ESP services that the contractor uses to meet requirements are in scope for the contractor's own assessment and certification. Non-cloud ESPs that don't handle CUI don't need a CMMC certification, but those services must meet whatever requirements would apply if they're not outsourced. And these ESPs may also voluntarily have a third-party CMMC assessment if they make that business decision for themselves. NIST 853, 171, FedRAMP, and CMMC all share two very important document requirements in common: the System Security Plan, known as an SSP, and the Plan of Action and Milestones, known as a POAM. And it's worth talking about these briefly because of how important they are. Creating these should be the first step for any organization. The 800-171 version of the requirement on the left, FedRAMP on the right. And in general, these documents provide an inventory of the in-scope system and the boundaries of that system and how each of those security controls is implemented. And if you have different security domains, you may have a separate SSP for each of those domains. And you can also have a higher level SSP for controls that get inherited by those subsidiaries. So for example, we had our shared services network and our level 2 and level 3 domains. You may have an SSP for shared services that get inherited by the SSPs for our level 2 and level 3 security domains from that example. And there are templates for these available from NIST and FedRAMP. And when you complete that SSP, you may realize that some of the required controls are not yet implemented. And so the next document is called a Plan of Action and Milestones, or a POAM, for any requirement that's not in place. And this document just describes how each missing control will be implemented and when the implementation will be complete. And again, template for this is available from NIST and FedRAMP. In some cases, you can use the POAMs to temporarily claim level 2 or level 3 compliance while working to address the missing controls. To qualify, all level 1 CMMC controls must be in place. There are certain level 2 requirements and level 3 requirements shown here in the bottom left that must also be in place. And the assessment score using DOD's scoring system has to be greater than or equal to 80%. The way they calculate this is a little funny, so just make sure you look up the actual source for that, for the way they do that division. If these conditions are met, the contractor can undergo an assessment and get what's called a conditional certification, which is effectively a completely valid CMMC certificate that can be used to win contracts and subcontracts. The catch is that within 180 days, all those missing requirements must be implemented, and a closeout assessment has to confirm that they're in place. And DOD says that if you don't meet that deadline, quote, standard contractual remedies will apply, and the system won't be eligible for additional awards if that certification expires without a closeout assessment, confirming that those missing requirements are in place. So that wraps it up. If you have any questions that you haven't submitted already, please submit them, and I'll get started on anything that's already in the queue. And while I do that, if you want to fire up the screenshots here, these are links to a bunch of the documents that I referenced here and different sources. So this is the, hopefully you get some useful information here going back to the original documents that I've been referencing. And the top two there, the Ultimate Guide to CUI and the Navigating Compliance FCI and CUI for federal contractors. The first one's a blog that I did a while back, and the second one is another webinar that are not DoD specific, but they dive into much more detail about what FCI and CUI are, and the webinar there, especially how the whole government regulation program works for CUI, just to get a better understanding of what CUI is, that I know a lot of contractors struggle with that. So hopefully that's helpful. So getting into the questions here, reading through. Yep. So the first question here, it looks like it's from a subcontractor, received a third-party vendor risk questionnaire regarding CMMC, NIST 800-171, and required to answer yes, no to these questions, not directly contracting with the DOD, but the requesting organization is the contractor. How far do the NIST SP 800-171 control requirements go if we don't necessarily deal with CUI? We simply provide transportation services for DoD contractor. Absolutely. This is why I took that deep dive into that whole definition of covered contractor information systems. And it frustrates me to no end because so many people, even within the contractors, the big, huge prime contractors that should know better, don't really understand that. And they just send out these questionnaires that say, are you NIST 800-171 compliant? Yes or no. Completely ignoring the fact that, well, if they're not sending you CUI, you don't have any NIST 800-171 compliance obligation. Really, what they should be doing is sending that DFARS 7012 clause to you word for word, and then you get to just look at it and decide, yeah, no, I don't have any CUI, so I have no obligation. So it's a huge problem. I don't have an easy answer for that other than pushing back on the contractor to say, hey, you're asking me about NIST 800-171. What CUI are you sending me? Are you sending me any CUI? And if the answer is no, using the kind of the documents that I've showed here and the source documents and the little kind of train of thought that I showed, you can demonstrate to them that, like, you don't have an 800-171 compliance obligation. They shouldn't be asking you those questions. CMMC is a little different because it covers FCI as well. So at the bare minimum, you're probably going to be on the hook for CMMC level 1, those 15 basic safeguards, but that's a much smaller lift than 800-171. But again, my other frustration is I've been seeing these questionnaires with CMMC requirements, and CMMC didn't exist until December and still isn't in DoD contracts. So nobody has a CMMC compliance obligation. So yeah, sorry, there's no good answer on that one, but you can try pushing back. Next question, is there a way around the government sponsorship for FedRAMP, looking to go down that route and able to sell cloud services to the government, but don't have a specific contractor requirement in hand? Unfortunately, no. There actually used to be something called the Joint Authorization Board, the JAB, that was a very competitive process where you could submit your cloud service and make the case for why it's useful to the government. They just canceled that program within the last few months. So that's gone away. The only way to get those authorizations now is with sponsorship. So my recommendation there is the FedRAMP requirements are open, available. You can grab the FedRAMP moderate requirements, start implementing them, start aligning with them, so that down the road, when it comes time to get a government contract, you're most of the way there. You've got the requirements, you just need the assessment. And that's something we'd be happy to help you with if you need help finding those documents or implementing those controls. That's what we do here at TrustedSec. Our security protection, next question, are security protection assets only in scope for CMM level 2 if they affect the security of CUI, but out of scope if they are specifically a monitoring tool, thinking something like a cloud configuration monitoring tool? It is an SPA, but has no effect on the security of CUI. Yeah, so that goes back to all those definitions of the definition of security protection asset is protecting something that is in scope for CMMC. So if you've got some kind of cloud monitoring tool, but nothing in that cloud is in scope for CMMC, then nope, not a security protection asset. CMMC doesn't care about it. The moment something in that cloud environment is in scope for CMMC, then and even as a risk managed asset or a specialized asset, then yep, it's in scope for CMMC because it's now a security protection asset for something that's in scope for CMMC. So that's they going back to that concept that the scope follows the data, and that the idea of building those enclaves that, if you want to keep your cloud out of scope, firewall it off from the things that are in scope and isolate it. I don't think I see any more questions. So with that, thanks everybody for attending, and you know where to find us if you have any more questions. This is what I do for a living, so if you have some deep, interesting questions on CMMC or NIST or any of the other stuff we've talked about here, I'm always happy to go down deep, scary rabbit holes into the depths of government contracting.